pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the...
Well, greetings and felicitations, children of technology. We have the killing technology. Well, maybe not us, but someone does, somewhere. Anyway, welcome to Agitators Anonymous, episode 113. I am Alan Averill, your hostess with the leastest. Well, indeed. So, festival season is kind of about to descend upon us. Hellfest is this weekend with its absolutely insane lineup. Primordial is playing on Friday, so I'm recording this a couple of days early. And I think, Primordial's schedule is not that hectic over the next couple of months. Maybe 10 festivals overall. I think the most we ever did was 20-something. We ain't a Rotten Christ, or we ain't a Marduk, or, I don't know, lots of other bands I see doing big summer tours, Blood Incantation, etc., whomever. But it's something. And it's all starting in earnest again. Of course, now, if you've been listening to a couple of episodes of the podcast ago, I discussed at the back end of the tour diary about how things were changing considerably for bands and all of the insane costs. But this got me thinking about a few comments people had made on YouTube, a few other bits and pieces, a few other quite informed questions people were asking me, one of which was, how do I think that musicians, the job of musicians, their day-to-day, the requirements placed upon them have changed since the 70s, 80s, 90s and up to now. And now, of course, I wasn't around to be a musician in the 70s and the 80s. So all my, I suppose, my references for them are anecdotal, speaking to people who were musicians back then, having worked within the industry for decades, talking to people who were doing the equivalent of when I was working A&R, doing my job in 1978 or 82 or whomever else. There was enough anecdotal references from people to gain, or, you read biographies, all that kind of thing, to have some insight into how the music industry has changed. And of course, I was there in the 90s and the noughties and the 2010s and all that kind of thing. So I just thought it might be interesting to take a kind of ramble, yes, I haven't used that word in a while, across some of the different requirements, some of the things that have changed. Of course, yes, I know, the internet, online, this, that, and the other. I mean, that's the biggest thing to discuss. But I'm not going to try and discuss that head on and get into Napster and all that kind of stuff and file trading and Spotify and all of that kind of thing. I think we all know by now how it changed the game. But there's a couple of other nuanced things and quite interesting observations that I thought might make a listenable episode 113, a quite interesting 113. No, it probably won't change your life. Well, it may do, but it probably won't. Unless, of course, you're driving to this and you happen to crash or something, and it is playing in the background while you're busy with your face being pummeled into an airbag somewhere, and then someone finds you and goes, well, I hope it was not that. The ridiculous misinformation with which you were hourly imbibing from this fool, this charlatan, this Mr. Averill, this singer in a heavy metal band. Well, anyway, yes, episode 113. You can follow me on Instagram, _Primordial. There's no Agitators Anonymous. Instagram, I just couldn't bring myself to be in charge of another Instagram, something else to death scroll through and waste my life on. So you'll have to follow me at _Primordial, Primordial _official, of course. But do remember, the podcast is my voice. It is not the podcast of Primordial, and any views expressed herein by the grown man-child of Nemthianga, which means he of the evil tongue, are not those expressed necessarily by the other tyrants in Primordial, the other grumpy old men. Anyway, so you can also go over to patreon.com /Alan Averill to support the show for as little as $1 a month. Primarily because I don't really understand how the tiers work and all that kind of stuff. Cool stuff going on there. Some, chats, conversations, demos, rehearsals, other things. And with the festival season kind of starting, I think there's going to be a few interesting little videos, backstage bits that I'm going to be able to make, which initially was my plan with the podcast. I recorded, I guess, a test or a pilot podcast maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and that was when you had access every summer to lots of different musicians at festivals. And I thought, all right, this is going to be something like a video chat channel or something like this. And that's kind of where the idea came from. A sort of backstage chat with somebody going, you have the gift of the gab. Now, I'm not entirely sure of that. There are other Irishmen I know who have a greater gift of the gab than I. That is for sure. But some part of that commentary seemed to make sense, which was, here is something which you kind of need to, and I hate this word because I think it's going to be used against an awful lot of us in the employment sector, is you need to pivot. It's a case of teaching an old dog new tricks. Or a further new trick that does not pay yet. Indeed. Anyway, which brings me to another comment, which is, if you do wish to sponsor the podcast, get in touch, slide into my DMs. The listener figures are well over, 220,000 or something, 200 and something thousand. So there is a captive audience there. Like I said, if you own an offshore munitions factory or a uranium mining plant, or maybe you own a coltan mine, and you need some nimble little fingers trafficked in, well, let's get on it. No, of course not. If you run a mail order, or you're printing some shirts or something like this, or maybe you run a tattoo shop, there we go. Anyway, so I thought it would be kind of interesting to take a look at the difference in being a musician right now in 2022 and what it was back in the day. Now, as I said, I have some experience of the different decades, but and anecdotal ones, or first-hand, second-hand stories from people who were back there in the day. But it's primarily about the way things were, based on conversations with plenty of people who worked in the industry back then. Biographies, podcast with older musicians, and anecdotes. Oddly enough, if you do look through the top podcasts, the top 200 or something, very, very few are done by musicians. They're mostly the preserve of comedians, or kind of like not really comedians, but YouTube sketch comedians, who've just transferred very easily into the podcast world. Some are about as inane as it can get. I really am incredibly surprised at how just random bus chats with people who don't have much to say can somehow, peak at the top of the charts. But I suppose this points to the level of loneliness that we all have in the year 2022. You forgot the lockdown and the pandemic and how you were all told to stay inside. But there is something maybe there for another podcast, which speaks to how isolated people are, that they listen to podcasts, to other people speaking, to have some company, so to speak. Anyway, bad company. Who can deny? Anyway, first things first, there's no particular order to these observations. There's no particular script. They kind of are as you will, as I'm sort of free fall thinking about them. Just whatever came into my mind at the moment. They're not chronological, and you might find I jump around the timeline, but hopefully it makes some sense. And some of this was prompted by a friend of mine saying to me that these days, and this might have even changed post-pandemic, but 25% of a musician's career, or the time they spent, is devoted to songwriting, or at least the craft of songwriting. Of course, there's no particular study about this or no particular statistic to point to. It's more sort of anecdotal, but I think there's some truth to it. And that is that 25% of things these days are really about the craft of the song. And the 75 is self-promotion or social media presence, which really means that the great portion of somebody's time is spent in trying to create a following, to create people to listen to their music, or in their own terms, and let's say it in heavy metal fashion, by their own hands, or create the brand. So the truth kind of is that unless you have a huge plan and a team of people behind you, and some money, and you know exactly how to market what you're doing, which, let's be honest, is not most people, you need to do the lion's share of work yourself before any label or booking agent or whoever might look at you. I.e., you have to do the groundwork to get to a point where somebody would work with you. Your average booking agent, and I say this to people repeatedly because I do actually do a bit of booking, is that a percentage of nothing is nothing. So if you're in a band without any fee, the amount of work it takes to move, let's say, 5 people in a band from Sweden to Berlin to play, to get collected, to arrange the back line, to tell the local promoter what their requirements are for the backstage, their technical requirements, who's the front of house, who's doing sound, who are you shipping the merch, all of these kind of things, which very often are left to a booking agent. That the same amount of work is required for a band who have a €10,000 fee for a festival as for a band who have a €500 fee festival. But the band, of course, with no fee is not making anyone any money. It's just an example. It's a slightly old-fashioned and antiquated example. But certainly in the meeting rooms, let's call them the A&R, and the artist representative meetings that go on about who might a label look at, who might they be interested to sign. And I think this goes for the mainstream as well as, let's call it the more mainstream rock and metal. I'm going to get into maybe why it's a little bit different for the underground. But for the mainstream of heavy metal, they will look at those things. They will say, well, how many... The band kind of has to get to a place that once upon a time that work was done by a label, and you got there by album 2 or album 3, maybe in the 70s or the 80s. You're allowed to kind of have a near miss with your first album and, try and grow into your second and third, which maybe hit home. But now that very first one, in fact, the one before even a label picks you up, has to have something of a viral load to it. A label will go, well, how many Instagram followers do they have? Is any of the band a star? And I'm doing that little parenthesis, rabbit ears there, which of course is helpful for a podcast. But what I mean by that is there somebody there to take on the work of social media, to post the backstage videos, to do all that 75% now, which is the grunt work. All of this was once the job of the promo department at a label, who, these do more or less exist. Also independent, independent companies who I sense, well, I would say more push emails. But, one thing most people don't really realize is the click-through rate for most promo emails is, I think, less than 3%, as far as I know, with even less people clicking through to music. It seems that our attention spans are so shredded, or we're so relatively disinterested. And I do also understand that amongst the modern deluge of music. It's insane. I am signed up to some promo, let's call them promo platforms. And there is just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of newer albums coming out every week. The whole, I think the pandemic and the lockdown, of course, accelerated some of this. But for young bands who are still excited, the new and growing wall for them to try and climb over to escape into the promised land of having some form of a career of being a musician, it's the enormity, the size of this wall is not quite yet revealed to them. But, most bands who hire digital PR companies are horrified at the click-through rates. Let's be honest, one viral or viewed video of a band member singing along to a song backstage, or maybe, this is how I warm up to the fastest Metallica riff. You pick a band who always gets clicks, and then you do something that can be tagged along in the algorithm with them, etc. And Rehearsal, this will unfortunately gain you way more views than any, unmusical things will reach. These unmusical things will reach far more people. I mean, do you online go to read interviews with bands? Who does? I mean, I certainly don't. A video interview, perhaps. So what you're required to do right now, these days, as being a musician, is also be your own video editor, your own PR and marketing, your own booker to a point until somebody might want to maybe book you, your own photographer, your own basically curating and trying to figure out how to create the brand, so to say. And I hate those words because, look, that's not the world I came from. I came from the underground world. Unless we add all of that, all of these 12 different job titles for no money, no recompense, because you won't be gaining anything back really from streaming numbers. Or unless, you want to game or create covers for tips, or maybe you have OnlyFans, I don't know. But you still have to build an audience first, and that's one of the most complicated things now. Now, of course, what I'm saying is more commentary about mainstream music or mainstream rock and metal. Few labels will touch a band, though, without any presence. Of course, if you are Mugwa and you're on Northern Heritage and you don't do press and you can simply rely on the greatness of your music, okay. But they still got big on word of mouth, i.e. the greatness of their music being spread between people online, people going fucking hell, have you heard this band yet? So it somehow dovetails with what I'm saying on one level with how big playing the game online is. But if you are talented enough to find other people to play that game for you, I suppose that's the difference. But the sad truth is that for mainstream rock, I'll give an example is I watched a Download special. Now, sometimes it's a hate watch. And because I don't recognise any of the bands playing, I'm a traditional metalhead. I'm not interested in Bury, Tomorrow, Shinedown, Control the Storm, Trementai, A Day to Remember, who all seem to have the same interchangeable band members. And whoa, 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 dun-dun-dun, dun-dun-dun-dun-dun, dun-dun-dun-dun, kind of riffs. Now, look, they aren't aimed at me, and a cursory glance reveals, as I said, the same kind of songs, the same kind of image. But I guarantee you each band has mastered social media. Has a big, young following and at least one member who is in charge of constantly streaming stories, backstage moments, who knows, maybe even a cookery program, a keep fit program. Maybe one of them is into weight. Well, you know, this is the kind of thing about these new bands. They're into weightlifting, they're into all sorts of other things. And they stream pretty much their entire lives. You could look at a good example as Dragon Force. Herman Lee, the guitar player of Dragon Force, I mean, has literally created this other side economy that I would imagine is bigger than Dragon Force for him, or Matt Heavey from Trivium, who they would appear to me to basically stream their whole lives from making coffee in the morning to, oh, someone dared me to make an Aha cover. This is what I'm going to do today. And people tip them for it. More power to them, I think, but this avenue is open to a very small amount of people. But it's certainly true that most labels now will look for what a band's presence is before they even contemplate signing them. And back in the day, this was left to the PR department of a label to break a band forward. But the idea now is that a band has to have all of that in place. And of course, you know, back in the day, there was a lot more money in the music industry, and they were throwing $100,000, $200,000 at bands in the 70s and 80s, and there was a lot more professionals around them trying to guide them. You had producers helping them songwrite and this, that, and the other. And believe me, there's an awful lot of labels now who are asking bands, well, can you give us your home recorded album for free? And we'll just see what happens. But it feeds into something. It all feeds into something someone on my YouTube commented, which I thought was very revealing and very interesting. You know, maybe am I speaking a little bit too fast? I don't know. I suppose I should have internalized that sentence. But back in the day, people identified with bands or characters. For example, Robert Smith of The Cure. He understands me. Morrissey of the Smiths speaks for me through his lyrics. James Hetfield understands my anger, my alienation, whoever it may be. The band you identified with, the band you chose as your subcultural identification was your, if you want to call it, emotional lifestyle choice. But something has clearly changed, and maybe this is a much more interesting premise for an entire podcast, because I think it's something much more societal and is really about, I suppose, a microcosm or a slightly different angle of the things that we discuss in the podcast anyway, about how a decade of social media derangement, or let's not call it derangement, whatever it is. The world we now inhabit after 10 years of social media has changed things so dramatically. One of those things that it has clearly changed is that now, as this person commented on my YouTube, bands are the backdrop to an individual's life, to their brand choice, to their brand building. I.e., if everyone is essentially their own brand, everybody is kind of externally living, everybody's trying to push out their own, and whatever their own social media presence is. And, you know, I'm as guilty as this, I'm maybe slightly less guilty than your average 14-year-old TikToker. But, I mean, I have over 10,000 people follow me on Instagram, and I know that it helps to gain, to get people across to listen to the podcast, to, you know, if you do want to sell a shirt, whatever else, dropping merch, whatever, as kids say it now. But if everyone is their own brand, and that's that thing that also labels are trying to identify with. They're trying to identify bands who do have that within them, ready to bring out, ready to exploit, so to say. If we put this in a terrible way, the word brand, which is horrible, but music has become the backdrop for a dance on TikTok, or closer to home, the background music to weightlifting, to gaming, to your story on Instagram, to your reel. It's It clearly ties in with the modern social media sense of ultra individualism. And I mean in a kind of OnlyFans sort of world weary way. Who can blame some younger people if they think this, creating their brand identity, is going to be the only job they get in a world going down the pan economically, and also a job they can see quite clearly. There are more millionaires before the age of 15 now than, well, at any time in history, because that just never happened in history. You can bypass the whole adult work, drudgery life by creating your own brand before the age of 15. And this traditionally was a time when teenagers were, I suppose, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, getting into music, identifying with bands. But now it seems that let's call it, it's more of a renter's market in the sense that bands are having to understand they are the backdrop for other people's identification. What this essentially does, I think, which has happened over the last 10 or 20 years, is remove or reduce music to that 10, 20, 30-second snippet that's happening behind somebody else's, a snapshot of their life. What it does is reduce music to an afterthought. Music is the background noise to your life rather than being the soundtrack to it, if that makes sense. If that makes sense, let me know in the comments, because I think this is a pretty interesting... Well, let me know in the comments, like the person who did actually let me know in the comments that was their idea, you know. And I thought this is a very pertinent, very clever observation of modern society. And this is one of the reasons why music seems, I suppose, so less important to younger people. As I said before on the podcast, anecdotally, my friends who have kids, trying to engage them to listen to not just a song, but a whole album, it seems to just fall on deaf ears. They just don't really have any engagement with it. It's too long a process, too involved. My friend's young son, he's trying to get him to learn how to play the bass. And the kid is asking, well, who would I play with? Now, I remember being 13, 14, 15, and everyone wanted to be in a band, because not only was being in a band a way of standing on a stage, getting a little bit more of a light shined on you if you were an awkward, uncomfortable kid, but who knows, maybe you could even meet a girl or impress a girl. Anyway, you do wonder about how things are going to pan out for young people in those respects, you know? I mean, as a complete side comment to that, and like I said, I do think that is a really interesting observation, the fact that music is now the backdrop. It's not the soundtrack to young people's lives. I think it makes so much sense. And when you listen to I did actually go and listen to Billie Eilish. I watched Billie Eilish at Coachella, and it struck me, how childish is this music? It sounds like cartoon music. It sounded like really a music for 12-year-olds. And you kind of realize, as I said before, that great interview with the band The Black Keys on Joe Rogan. Mainly it's just the drummer's 3-hour one-man show. He's hilarious. And he just said that's one of the problems with the modern music industry, is that it is enthralled to the clicks of children. And therefore you get this music that is just so caught up in being, as I said, the backdrop for being a pre-adolescent. It's not really the soundtrack to your adulthood or your emotional development, or you're moving into your late teens or whatever else. Hey, what did I just say? I was listening to Billie Eilish. I observed it purely for philanthropic, anthropological, cultural reasons indeed. Well, I think that might be a very good, interesting podcast discussion, and so I might flesh it out. But a few of the things that have changed over the years. One of them is, and these are, like I said, a bit scattergun, a bit all over the place, and I'm sure there's something I'm going to miss, but jamming or rehearsing. First, there are some important contexts to address. The first one being that on average, in the 1970s, most families' take-home pay, industrial wage, was growing. People could afford, especially if you were in the US, a basement with some instruments. Now, this is a kind of an observation that I never really thought about before, but a friend of mine said when he came over here to visit, he goes, none of you guys have basements. How did you ever form bands? And I went, that's very interesting. Because in the United States, especially in the 1970s, there was a kind of sense of upward mobility, and this sort of post-World War II dream of the American dream, I guess, for your average worker was in full swing, combined with, of course, the growth of 70s rock. And let's consider it the general mood of optimism on some level, despite the hangover of the Vietnam War and the continuing Cold War issues. The mood across the US, by all accounts, and this may be just anecdotal nonsense, was positive. Let's call it a bit Van Halen. And I think this inspired many young people to go and take up instruments. While the UK, for example, was maybe mired in debt, there were race riots, the IMF was called into the country in the early 1970s, huge joblessness and unemployment. Let's say even if 70s glam was the sonic pushback against the gloom of the industrial horizon, the opening chords of Black Sabbath somehow seemed to define the mood in the UK. Despite this, I would have to observe people were not back then saddled with huge debts. Being a student graduating in the early 1980s, that was a bit of a complex thought, I suppose. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that there were a couple of different moods of inspiration that were moving through the 1970s, which inspired kids to take up instruments, take up arms. You know, one was perhaps pushing back against the gloom and agitation of the state, pushing back against the news. The birth of a new kind of teen movement in the 1960s carried across into the 1970s. But being a student graduating in the early 1980s and picking up that axe as you did and hearing Venom a la Kerry King or Dave Mustaine, you were not, as kids are now often emerging in a form of financial slavery, saddled with huge debts. And I think this is an important economic consideration. Well, that's a rather complex, all over the place thought that I had there. But what I'm trying to say is when we think about these things is that living in 1981, as new wave of British heavy metal broke, as our heroes like a Mustaine or a Hetfield set out, was cheaper. The idea that you might get on the property ladder or have an apartment in a capital city as a young, hungry, developing artist was not as outlandish as it seems now. Whereas now artists are driven from most capital cities across the Western world by, for example, the BlackRock ideology of debt. It's just an important consideration, I think, when you look at the development of being a musician through the decades. And one of that is that there's the separation of peoples, but that life might have been a little bit simpler, a little bit easier, definitely a lot poorer, but the people were not saddled with huge personal debt. And I think this gave them a certain freedom on some level to try and start a band. And this was the aspiration of many, many young people. It's just a consideration. It's a rather all over the place thought, but there are older folks I've chatted to who will say to me things like, oh, well, these kids don't want to tour. Believe me, bands do now, and they would love to be able to live from music. But that route, that was open to a band, let's say from 1977 to 1983 or even to 1988, of charitable growth, or at least the optimism that it might happen, that you might break through. This dream does not really exist anymore. Most kids are brutally honest of the assessment that being a musician is not going to make you any kind of a living. Well, not unless you're, of course, an expert at the 12 other things you're expected to be, well, an expert at, to compensate that musical journey. But the chances of making it to that place on songwriting alone is virtually nil. It was not as pessimistic. It's not as, let's say this. It was not as pessimistic in other decades, is what I can say with certainty, is that there seemed to be a way through once upon a time. That was a rather complicated thought. I'm not sure that I really quite explained that properly. This is the reason why sometimes you write some notes. What I was trying to say there was there are different financial concerns, I think, for kids right now, and that being saddled with huge personal debt was maybe less of a concern in 1982 than it is in 2022. But honing their skills every day, bands jamming or rehearsing, you couldn't fake being a tight rehearsed band in 1976 or 1986 like you can now. I know plenty of stories from engineers who tell me about bands who arrive now in the studio, if they do even go to a studio, who have never even been in the same room together. They expect digital miracles of cut and paste. This was not possible back in the day. You had to be as tight as you sounded. And we all know the stories of Metallica all living in a house today, playing every day, dedicated in the rehearsal room every night. This, I think, doesn't exist anymore. Most people have given into the convenience of headset Zoom rehearsals or just trading files. And it all adds to the sort of anti-human nature of an awful lot of modern music, and I think that modern heavy metal suffers from that. It's also one of the reasons why rock or metal music is just not, it's not a viable thing in the mainstream anymore. And this returns to what I just said a while ago, is that it's very hard to market 5 individuals to young people anymore. They want, as I said, the Billie Irish, Billie Eilish. That's a good name for a Billie Eilish covers band from Ireland. Or maybe some sort of Irish nationalistic covers band of Billie Eilish. Anyway, they want names because they're easily marketable. That is the brand of that person. It's one of the reasons why rock and metal doesn't really work in the mainstream anymore, because it's just too complicated to identify 4 or 5 different people with an album, with long songs, who don't have dances, etc., etc. It's another reason why I guess back in the day prog music was so popular in the 1970s, because people understood the craft of being a musician a bit more. Of course, punk fundamentally changed things, but don't tell me that the Ramones weren't a rehearsed, well-oiled war machine, a finely oiled rock and roll machine. As people slip into modes of remote living, so bands rehearse remotely, trading files, adding their own parts alone. I've often said this is not how you make metal or rock, as you need the human interaction. And personally, I would not make a record like this, but many, many people do. Nothing wrong with it, but I know bands who jam on Zoom with headphone sets and write like this, and they never even really meet to rehearse or to make an album. So I think this reality just reflects the way the modern world is or has become, how people are cocooned in the burbs working alone. It's not how I want to make metal, but there are bands out there who, like as I said, never meet. They never write together, they mix independently, and if they play gigs, maybe they only meet for an hour or two before that for a tour. It's one of the reasons bands back in the day had this us against the world, die-hard mentality, if you ask me. They lived and breathed their music. The Iron Maidens of this world could never, I think, exist in a modern climate. We are all too separated and disparate. It's one of the reasons, as I said, why in a mainstream capacity, rock and metal has dropped off the radar commercially. The human context, experience, is just less important as a cultural sense, I think, than it was. The band itself was seen as your job. This is what you worked at back in the day, and someday it might repay you or reward you. And as I said, what might reward you now is a brand deal or a gaming deal or being sponsored by some other company external to music. You're certainly not generally going to make it from streaming music unless it's hundreds of millions of streams. But the idea that this is how a band feels right now is almost a complete fallacy. Primordial is not a professional band on any level. Could we ever have been? It's unlikely considering the cost of living in a country like Ireland over the last 20 years. But all musicians now work. There is no choice. Again, upward mobility. Bands at one stage had that. So when people in the industry go, oh, this band doesn't want to tour, what they have to realize is that they're also juggling their future. They're juggling the prospects of, well, how do I pay the rent when I get home? And now you've heard me in the podcast talk about the growing costs of being in a band, and how an awful lot of bands are not even making 50% of what they did pre-pandemic, because flights are now 4, 5, 6, 700 euro. And there is no concept of some sort of base minimum wage for any band who playing at a festival at a certain level. There's no sliding scale rule of you have this many streams, therefore you should be guaranteed, each musician, to walk home with 250 euro per day, like, crew people are, for example. So you can walk home with less than everyone else as a musician now. Anyway, that's a different story, isn't it? You bought gear back in the day. You invested in your backline. You bought that van. You played anywhere you could. That's the romantic vision of how a band is, of course, and that does still exist. I mean, I just was looking on Instagram at Blood Incantation doing a 2-week tour across Europe, and here's a great band who are blowing up in the metal scene quite, and it's quite righteously. They're a band who deserve it. There's a few sold outs next to their shows, and my friend Daniel from Killtown books them, and this is the old-fashioned way of how this band has got big, but most bands this is a very romantic vision, and it doesn't really exist quite the same in the mainstream, I think. Most bands who are doing that are hawking merch to get to the next city, and that dream, that romantic vision of what a band is never really dies. It's just making it through the gate, or over the wall, if you want, to the promised land, to the USA, to open pasture. That gate is so small now. The reality is making it on those terms depends on many other things. That romantic notion is encapsulated in Henry Rollins' Get in the Van, which I've mentioned again and again, which I would recommend going and listen to the audiobook of which he narrates. I've done that. It exists, and it's a beautiful, romantic, hard, demanding slog, and it's not dead yet. But back in the day, you made your demo in order to get signed. You sent it around to A&R people to try and make industry waves. And this differed from the early to the late 80s. By, let's say, 1987, the early death metal bands had started selling their demos for $3 or $4 or $5. I ordered many demos back in the 88 to 93 period. Even our own demo, which came out in 1993, we sold maybe 1,100 in the post at £2 and £3 and £4 or $5. It's a tiny, small micro economy that you grew up with, that generally you invest back into the band, but you can print a couple of shirts and that kind of thing. It's hard to say if bands even really do demos anymore. At least pressing them and giving them to A&R people won't work, as no one wants physical copies anymore. A friend of mine once was trying to impress a label boss who was visiting here at a gig, and made a huge big tape box, a huge big wooden box full of shirts and CDs and tapes. And this was just at the edge of when all that was going out, and said label boss said to me, well, how am I supposed to get this through airport security? He could have just given me a USB clip. Well, now that US isn't even a USB clip, it's just a link to download, and you're pretty sure most people are not going to click on that link. But back in the day, you saved your money to go into a proper studio for a couple of hours. I think the first Primordial demo was made for £50, and that was quite hard to save up. We didn't have any money. I know the guys in Primordial used to pick potatoes for £1 for one bag, and one bag was fucking huge. And they used to pick, you had to fill a whole bag with potatoes for £1 back in the, whatever this was, 1991, 92, 93. And you did this all summer, broke your back. Of course I didn't. I mean, how could a young Liberace like myself ruin his cuticles with such hard work? But you understand, some of us had to do it. But back in the day, you saved your money to go into a proper studio, and then you made your demo in order to get signed. And you often had a manager, or, a fanager, as people called them, as people call them over the last decade or so. But bands hustled themselves, and a manager would pick them up. By the late 80s, they were writing fan letters, all this kind of thing, the independent fanzines. I guess this is where metal and the whole punk kind of DIY movement dovetailed into kind of sidestepping some of the mainstream rock, the mainstream way of representing your band and getting noticed. But the idea, for example, of signing with a talent agency, a big manager, even as a metal band, or some kind of representative, was par for the course. If you listen to the amazing Neat Records podcast, Neat Records released Venom, Raven, Tigers of Pantang, all sorts of stuff. Just search Neat Records podcast on your Spotify or on your podcast platform. It's great. They discuss their links to the late 70s Newcastle or North of England talent scout scene. So you can picture this, the guy with the tight flannel suit breathing cigar smoke on you with a glass of cognac, who had a troupe of dancers, a juggler, two working class northern comedians who did men's clubs, and a few stand-ups on his books or whatever. And he's there going, oh, what's all the fuss about this band Def Leppard? Anyway, this pretty much died away as we moved to the late 80s and 90s, and it's certainly not the same now, because, and when I return to what I said at the top of the podcast, a percentage of nothing is nothing. So having a manager, your laptop was a phone, and you made calls to get gigs. Again, the Black Flag Minneapolis hardcore documentary I linked before makes it very clear. There were big bands, stadium bands and covers bands, often in the bars, but finding a venue that would put on an independent band in some cities in the early 80s was a network of letter writing and phone calling. The scene owes to punk rock, I think, and the ideal encapsulated, for example, by Husker Du in their documentary, or Minor Threat, for example. Of course, Iron Maiden did this up and down the UK in 79 and 80 in the Green Goddess, which was their old van. So it's not exclusive to punk rock, but the indie touring circuit in the US, and I would imagine in many European countries, owes a lot to that one dude doing the fanzine who found a venue, put on a show or two. Bands like Sodom and that kind of thing, they didn't really tour Europe till they got to Persecution Mania. There wasn't a thrash touring circuit in 83, 84. Maybe Destruction traded a gig with Living Death, with Protector, with whoever else. But like I said, as we enter a new decade, and I mentioned it before, gentrification has changed cities incredibly, and the live music venue is kind of disappearing, I think. Venues disappeared. DJs kind of did in for much of them in the 90s and the noughties, cheaper to set up and easier to make money on. But now, post-pandemic, you have to wonder how venues can survive. And of course, if there is any hint of restrictions coming back, they are done. Before we get to the petrol issue, blah, 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 tour to 50 people a night on a 500 guarantee with a van and a place to sleep and eat, including that, becomes impossible. Like I said a couple of years ago, let's go to 2016, touring to 50 people a night was economically viable. You could just about sell, if you sold 10, 15, 20 pieces of merch, get gas, sleep on someone's floor, 50 people a night, maybe at, €10, you could get a few £100. It would pay for the hire of a van and a driver. Now, I think with energy, cost of living, petrol and gas costs, that sort of low margin line is going to become kind of impossible. Anyway, we hit the 40-minute mark there. It's a kind of a ramble all over the place. There's some topics in there that I would like to explore further. I would really like to maybe get someone on to discuss the idea of how music essentially has become the backdrop to our brands, whereas once it was the soundtrack to our lives. That's something very interesting, something I might bring back up in a further podcast. So maybe we can consider this sort of ramble across the different the different jobs that you need to do as a musician. I think now what you're required to do as a musician in 2022 as opposed to 1992 or 82, you've so much other things that once upon a time bands were given huge sums to make videos. Someone edited the video. The PR department, hawked the video around MTV, hoping to get a good slot. Bands really rehearsed and concentrated on playing and writing and getting out there, honing their stagecraft. But that seems to be less and less of an importance to all of the other now peripheral things, which a label or which musicians need to use as their tools to somehow exploit, so to speak, that horrible word, the brand. Because it's such a crowded and crazy marketplace, very few bands escape out the Mugwa or Blood Incantation way. Now, of course, I'm kind of talking more about the mainstream rock metal audience in general, not really, underground stuff. But at the same time, it is clear that your average musician who's just coming up, maybe even as an acoustic singer, songwriter or something like this, needs to have their game honed on so many other fronts. And, we've all seen those musicians who, as I said, make their money from a gaming channel. They're up making coffee. They're doing cookery channels. They're doing all sorts of other things. And you are required to edit your own videos, to be your own promo department, so to speak. And so that's what it is, whether you like it, whether we like it or not. Unless you're very, very lucky in a very small percentage or minority, this is the game that we have to play. And it is a game that is fundamentally opposed to creativity, to art, to being human with each other and all of those kind of things that I think are essential for creating rock and metal and proper bands. Now, thankfully, there's enough great bands out there that I'm not that worried, but I do think it speaks to why maybe metal and rock just has so little resonance in a kind of infantilized mainstream world that is only really interested in music, as I said, as a backdrop to a 20-minute, 30-second snippet of your brand, your life. Anyway, my friends, episode 113 of Agitators Anonymous podcast. I am Alan Averill. I'm off to some festivals shortly, and we'll make some reports and podcasts about those. Until then, Planet Satan over and out.